Dae-young tried to speak, but his throat was raw from days of disuse, and the breathing tube that had kept him alive stopped him with a gentle touch of one of her 4 hands against his lips. "Do not try to talk yet," she said softly. "The doctors say you need rest, that your body has been through more trauma than they thought possible for a human to survive." She was crying, and Dae-young did not understand why until she lifted one of the newborns and placed the tiny creature in his uninjured arm. The baby was warm and impossibly light, with violet eyes that blinked up at him with the unfocused curiosity of new life. "This is Daejin," Yanha said. "I named him after the human who saved his life before he was born." Dae-young looked down at the infant in his arm, and something inside him that had been locked away for 20 years began to crack. He had spent 2 decades building walls around his heart, fortifying himself against guilt and grief and the memory of a sister who had screamed his name. While he hid, he had turned himself into a weapon, a soldier, a man who could face 100 monsters without flinching. But he had not prepared himself. For this, a mother had named her child after him. She had looked at her son and decided that the name Dae-young was worthy of being carried into the future, that the man who bore that name had done something worth remembering. The walls cracked wider. "And this is Siala," Yanha continued, adjusting the second infant in her arms. "Her name means gift in your language and in mine. And the doctors tell me that such coincidences do not exist, that the universe does not work that way." She smiled through her tears. "But I think perhaps the universe knew something we did not." Dae-young's vision blurred, and he realized with distant surprise that he was crying. He had not cried since he was 14 years old. Since the night the pirates took his sister, he had promised himself then that tears were weakness, that emotions were vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. But now tears streamed down his face, and he could not stop them. "I did not do it for thanks," he managed to whisper. "I know," Yanha replied. "You did it because you could not do otherwise. Because somewhere inside you, there is a wound that never healed. And fighting for my children was a way of fighting for someone you lost long ago." Dae-young stared at her with eyes that held 20 years of accumulated pain. "How do you know that?" "Because you talk in your sleep," Yanha said gently. "For 3 days I sat beside you while you fought death, and you called out for someone named Soin, begging her to forgive you, promising her that you stayed this time." The walls shattered complete. Jung wept like he had not wept since childhood. Great heaving sobs that shook his damaged body and sent fresh pain through his barely healed wounds. He wept for his sister, who had screamed for him and received only silence. Wept for the 14-year-old boy who had been too afraid to fight. He wept for 20 years of guilt and loneliness and the desperate need to become someone worthy of the life he had saved by hiding. Jeonha held him as he cried, careful not to disturb his injuries, her forearms wrapping around him with a gentleness that felt like absolution. She did not tell him that everything was all right. She did not offer empty platitudes or meaningless comfort. She simply held him and let him grieve for the sister he had lost and the man he had forced himself to become. When the tears finally stopped, Dae-young felt empty in a way that was strangely peaceful. The guilt was still there, would always be there, but it no longer controlled him. It had become something he carried rather than something that carried him. "Thank you," he whispered to Yanha. "For what?" "For letting me be the person my sister needed me to be." The weeks that followed were filled with recovery and quiet moments. Dae-young remained in the medical bay as his body slowly healed, and Yanha brought the twins to visit every day without fail. It became a ritual, a sacred routine that neither of them questioned. She would arrive in the morning with Daejin and Siala, and Dae-young would hold one infant while she held the other, and they would talk about nothing important while the babies slept. The Valorian medical staff watched these visits with curious eyes. They had never seen one of their own form such a bond with a human, had never understood why the violent species seemed to inspire such loyalty in those they protected, but they did not interfere. Because there was something in the way Yonha looked at Dae-young that transcended species and culture and everything they thought they knew about the universe. 3 weeks after Dae-young woke up, Elder Toven came to visit. The Valorian leader moved slowly, weighed down by the events that had reshaped his understanding of humans and their place in the galaxy. He stood beside Dae-young's bed and was silent for a long moment before speaking. "I have come to thank you formally on behalf of all Valorians," Toven finally said. "What you did at the mining outpost has become legendary among my people. A story that parents tell their children about the human who fought 100 monsters to save a mother and her twins." Dae-young shifted uncomfortably in his bed. "I just did what needed to be done." "No," Toven replied firmly. "You did what no Valorian would have considered doing. What our entire culture would have dismissed as irrational suicide, and yet here we are, having a conversation because a human chose to be irrational." The elder paused, gathering his thoughts. "I have studied your species for many years, Sergeant Park, and I believed I understood you. But I was wrong, because I understood the violence without understanding the love that drives it." He sat down in the chair beside the bed, his forearms folded in his lap. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do humans fight like that, against impossible odds, with no logical expectation of survival, as though death is simply an obstacle to be overcome through stubbornness?" Dae-young looked past the elder to where Yana stood in the doorway, the twins cradled in her arms. She smiled at him, and he felt something warm bloom in his chest. "We do not fight because we calculate that we will win," Dae-young said slowly. "We fight because some things are worth dying for, even if we do. And the universe does not get to decide what those things are." Toven considered this for a long moment. "That is terrifying," he finally admitted. "That is perhaps the most terrifying thing I have ever heard, because it means there is no limit to what a human will do when protecting something they love." Dae-young smiled with scarred lips. "Good," he said. "That means you understand why we make good friends too." The elder left shortly after, and Yonha took his place in the chair beside Thee. But Ajun and Ciala were sleeping in her lower arms, while her upper hands reached out to take Dae-young's fingers. "The doctors say you can leave the medical bay next week," she said. "You will need months of rehabilitation, but you will walk again, and eventually you will be strong again." "And then what?" Dae-young asked. "I do not know where I belong anymore, because the man who came to this colony 2 years ago is gone, and I am not sure who replaced him." Yonha squeezed his hand. "You belong with people who know what you did," she said. "You belong with a family that would not exist without you." Dae-young looked at her, at the twins she held, at the future that had seemed impossible just weeks ago. "Are you asking me to stay?" "I am asking you to let yourself be loved," Yonha replied. "Not as a debt to be repaid, not as gratitude for service rendered, but as family, because that is what you are to us now." The sun set outside the medical bay window, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Young watched the colors change and felt something he had not felt in 20 years. He felt hope. "I would like that," he said softly. "I would like to be part of a family again." Yonha leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his in the Valorian gesture of deep affection. "Then stay," she whispered. "Stay and watch my children grow up, knowing the name of the human who gave them life." Dae-young closed his eyes, and for the first time since he was 14 years old, the voice of his sister in his memory was not screaming. She was smiling. The final assault came like a black wave crashing against the shore. Dae-young pushed himself to his feet through pain that should have been impossible to overcome, planted his boots on the blood-slicked floor, and swung the mining pick with everything he had left. The first scath fell with its skull caved in. The second lost two of its blade arms before a third strike opened its throat. Dae-young fought in the doorway, making his broken body into a wall that the swarm could not pass. He was screaming now, though he did not remember starting. A raw howl of defiance that drowned out the clicking of the scath and the pounding of his own failing heart. 3 more scath died under the mining pick, then 4 more than the pick lodged in a monster's chitin and was torn from his grip. Dae-young drew the combat knife from his boot and kept fighting. A blade arm sliced across his chest, opening a wound that sprayed blood across the walls. Another blade caught his leg, and he felt something snap inside his knee. He fell against the doorframe, but did not go down, bracing himself with his shoulder while his knife found the soft joint beneath. A scath's mandible, 84 scath dead. The number burned in his mind like a prayer. He had killed 84 monsters, and there were only 33 left. And maybe that was enough. Maybe he had bought enough time. Maybe Yonha and her children would survive, even if he did note a scath blade pierced his side, sliding between his ribs with a cold precision that stole his breath. Dae-young looked down at the blade protruding from his body and felt something that might have been surprise. So this was how it ended. He grabbed the scath's arm with both hands, ignoring the agony that exploded through his chest, and pulled the creature close enough to headbutt it directly in its clustered eyes. The monster screamed and staggered back, pulling its blade free from Dae-young's body. Blood poured from the wound, and Dae-young knew with terrible clarity that this was a killing injury, that he had minutes at most before he bled out. He raised his knife anyway, and then, impossibly, the scath began to retreat. They pulled back from the doorway, their clicking communication reaching a fever pitch as information spread through the swarm. Dae-young did not understand at first, could not process what was happening through the fog of blood loss and exhaustion. Then he heard it. The distant thunder of spacecraft entering atmosphere. Evacuation ships had arrived early. The scath's swarm mind had sensed the incoming vessels, had calculated that reinforcements were coming, had made the cold decision that further losses were not acceptable. When prey was escaping, 33 scath turned and fled into the wilderness, abandoning the outpost and the human who had killed 84 of their number. Dae-young watched them go, then his legs gave out, and he collapsed against the doorframe, sliding down to the floor in a spreading pool of his own blood. Dae-young. Yonha's voice was distant, coming from somewhere far away. He heard footsteps and felt hands touching his face. 4 gentle hands that belonged to someone he had sworn to protect. "Stay with me?" Yonha begged. "The ships are coming, and help is almost here, so you cannot die now." Dae-young tried to speak, but blood filled his mouth. He coughed and tasted copper. "Safe," he managed to whisper. "You are safe now. Because of you," Yonha said, tears streaming down her pearlescent face. "Because you fought 100 monsters and refused to fall. The rescue teams found them 2 hours later. They came through the ruined main entrance in full combat armor, weapons ready for a battle that had already been won. The team leader was a veteran named Captain Jinho Seong, who had fought scath on 3 different worlds and had never seen anything like the scene that greeted him in the mining outpost. 4 dead scath lay scattered through the corridors. The walls were painted with green ichor and red blood in equal measure. Blast marks and blade gouges told the story of a battle that should have been impossible, a defense that defied every rational calculation of survival. And at the end of it all, sitting in a pool of blood with a pregnant Valorian woman cradling his head, was a single human who had somehow refused to die. "Get the medics in here now," Captain Seong shouted. "We have a survivor." The medical team worked frantically to stabilize Dae-young. They sealed his wounds with emergency foam, pumped synthetic blood into his depleted veins, and loaded him onto a stretcher with movements that were quick, but careful. Yunha refused to leave his side, her forearms clutching the stretcher rail as they carried him to the evacuation ship. 30% chance of survival, one of the medics reported to Captain Seong. He has lost more blood than any human should be able to lose and still breathe. And his injuries would have killed most people hours ago. Then how is he still alive? The captain asked. The medic shook his head with an expression that mixed disbelief with awe. I have no idea, sir, because by every medical standard I know, this man should have died 6 times tonight. The evacuation ship lifted off and left the mining outpost behind, carrying De Jong to the medical facilities on the main colony vessel in orbit. Word spread quickly through the refugee population. The Valorians, who had dismissed humans as useful but primitive, who had quietly mocked their violent tendencies and their lack of refined emotional depth, now gathered in small groups and spoke in hushed voices about the human who had killed 84 Sketh with his own hands. They did not know how to process what had happened. Their entire cultural framework told them that violence was primitive, that fighting was a failure of wisdom, that beings who resorted to physical force were spiritually inferior to those who solved problems through patience and intelligence. But a human had heard that a mother and her unborn children were in danger, and he had not calculated odds or debated philosophy. He had picked up weapons and walked into certain death because someone needed to stand between innocence and monsters. The Valorians had no word for what De Jong had done. The closest translation in their language was protective madness, but that phrase carried negative connotations that felt wrong now. Needed a new word, a new concept, a new understanding of what it meant to be human. 3 days past, De Jong lay in the medical bay of the colony vessel, suspended between life and death while machines fought to keep his damaged body function. Injana visited every hour that the doctors allowed, sitting beside his bed and speaking to him in soft Valorian phrases that she hoped he could somehow hear. In the 3rd day, she went into labor. The birth was difficult but successful, and when it was over, Yanha held 2 newborns in her forearms, a boy with his father's violet eyes and a girl with her mother's shimmering skin. She named them immediately, before the doctors had even finished their initial examinations. The boy would be called Dejun, the Valorian phonetic adaptation of the human name that meant great and talented. The girl would be called Siala, a name that meant gift in Korean, and by pure coincidence that felt like destiny, also meant gift in the old Valorian tongue. When the doctors asked why she had chosen human names for Valorian children, Yanha simply smiled. Because a human gave them the chance to be born, she said, and they will grow up knowing that debt. On the 4th day, De Jong woke up. The first thing he saw was a Valorian woman sitting beside his bed, holding 2 tiny newborns who looked at him with curious violet eyes. Yanha was weeping, and somehow, despite everything, De Jong found the strength to smile. The main door exploded inward, and the Sketh poured through like a flood of black chitin and blade limbs. De Jong opened fire. The corridor lit up with muzzle flashes as he emptied his first magazine into the mass of bodies. 3 Sketh fell in the initial burst, their screams cutting off as bullets found the soft joints between their armor plates. 4 more stumbled over the corpses, and De Jong dropped them with precise shots to their heads. The narrow corridor worked exactly as he had planned, forcing the monsters to funnel toward him in groups of 2 or 3 instead of overwhelming him with their full numbers. He retreated slowly, firing in controlled bursts, counting every bullet and every kill. 7 Sketh dead, then 12, then 19. The creatures learned quickly, adapting their tactics with the cold intelligence of a swarm mind. They stopped charging blindly and began advancing in waves. using the bodies of their fallen as shields, while others climbed along the walls, and, sealing De Young threw his first grenade and watched it turn 5 more Sketh into scattered pieces of chitin and green ichor. The explosion bought him time to reload, and he fell back to his second defensive position. 24 down, he muttered to himself, keeping count because the numbers mattered. Because every kill was one less monster that could reach Yonhei. Sketh pressed forward relentlessly. One of them moved faster than the others, leaping over its companions and slashing at De Young with blade arms that whistled through the air. He dodged left, feeling the wind of the strike against his cheek, and put 3 bullets through the creature's throat, but the movement had thrown off his aim, and another Sketh closed the distance before he could recover. Its blade caught him across the left arm, slicing through his jacket, and the flesh beneath pain exploded through his body. Hot and sharp, and real De Young screamed and fired point blank into the monster's face, then kicked its twitching corpse back into its companions. He retreated faster now, blood dripping from his wounded arm and leaving a trail on the metal floor. Status report. Yana's voice came through the communication link. Tight with fear. Holding. De Young replied through gritted teeth. 27 down. Arm wounded, but functional. You are hurt. I expected to be hurt, he said. Keep the channel clear unless there is an emergency. He reached his third defensive position and pressed his back against the wall. Breathing hard, the Sketh had paused their advance, regrouping in the corridor ahead, their clicking communication filling the air with an alien rhythm. De Young used the brief respite to wrap his wounded arm with a strip torn from his jacket. Cut was deep, but had missed the major arteries, and he could still grip his rifle with both hands. The swarm attacked again. This time they came from multiple angles. Having found ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels that Jung had not been able to fully seal, he fought in all directions, spinning and firing and retreating through corridors that had become a maze of death. His second rifle ran dry, and he switched to pistols as Sketh dropped from the ceiling behind him, and De Young felt its blade pierce his back just below the shoulder blade. He twisted and jammed his pistol into the creature's mouth, pulling the trigger until the weapon clicked empty. The monster fell, taking a piece of his flesh with it. 31 Sketh. De Young stumbled and caught himself against the wall. Blood flowed freely from his back now, mixing with the blood from his arm, and his vision was starting to blur at the edges. He had known this would happen, had calculated that his body would fail before the swarm was defeated. But calculation and experience were different things. The pain was a constant scream in his nerves, and every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his damaged muscles. He reached the fourth defensive position, a junction where 4 corridors met, and triggered the improvised explosives he had planted earlier. The blast collapsed 2 of the corridors completely, cutting off the flanking routes and forcing the Sketh back to the main passage. 53 Sketh dead from the explosion and the fighting that preceded it. De Young laughed, and the sound was wild with exhaustion and defiance. 64 left, he said to no one. I can do 64. He picked up a mining pick from the equipment he had staged at this position and tested its weight. In his good hand, his ammunition was almost gone, but he still had grenades and improvised weapons, and he still had his stubborn, irrational, beautifully human refusal to accept defeat. Hours passed in a blur of violence and pain. De Young lost track of time, lost track of everything, except the next Sketh to kill and the door behind him where Yanha waited. He fought with grenades until he ran out. He fought with his last pistol until the magazine was empty. He fought with the mining pick, swinging it in wide arcs that split chitin and crushed skulls. He fought with a welding torch, burning Sketh that got too close, filling the corridors with the stench of charred meat. 73 Sketh. De Young could barely stand now. His broken arm hung useless at his side, snapped by a Sketh blade during a close encounter he barely remembered. His Back wound had stopped bleeding only because he had cauterized it with the welding torch. Gritting his teeth against pain that nearly made him pass out, his vision was gray at the edges, and every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. But dawnlight was beginning to filter through the facility's damaged sections, and the Sketh had grown cautious. They circled the final corridor like sharks around wounded prey, clicking and communicating in their alien language, probing for weakness but no longer charging blindly. They had learned respect for the human who had killed 73 of their number. They had learned to fear the monster who guarded the door, Yanha. Dae-Young said through the communication link, his voice barely a whisper. I need a status update on the evacuation ships. Still 31 hours away, she replied, and her voice cracked with emotion. Dae-Young, I can hear the fighting through the walls, and I know how badly you are hurt. I just need to hold a little longer. You have been saying that for 8 hours. Had it been 8 hours already? Dae-Young leaned against the doorframe that separated him from the final corridor, leading to Yon's chamber. 34 Sketh remained, and they were all watching him, waiting for him to collapse, waiting for the human to finally admit that biology had limits that courage could not overcome. I'm going to sit down now, Dae-Young said, just for a moment. He slid down the wall until he was seated on the floor, his back pressed against the metal. His eyes fixed on the darkness where the Sketh waited. The mining pick rested across his lap, and his one functional hand gripped it with fingers that had gone white from pressure. The Sketh clicked among themselves, and Dae-Young could almost imagine they were debating whether this was a trap or genuine weakness. He smiled with bloody teeth. Come on, men, he whispered. I am right here, and I am not going anywhere. The first Sketh moved forward cautiously, then another. Then the entire remaining swarm began its final advance. Dae-Young thought of his sister and whispered words in Korean that no one else could hear. This time, I stayed. Soyeon. He raised the mining pick and prepared to die on his feet. The crawler vehicle bounced over rough terrain as Dae-Young drove north through the darkness, his hands steady on the controls, despite the fear that churned in his stomach. Sheena sat beside him, her forearms wrapped protectively around her pregnant belly, her violet eyes watching the human with a mixture of confusion and something that might have been gratitude. The colony's lights had faded behind them an hour ago, and now there was only the dim glow of the dashboard and the vast alien wilderness stretching in every direction. Dae-Young had argued with the other human guards before leaving. Minji and Yunsu had demanded to come with him, their faces hard with determination, but Dae-Young had refused them with equal determination. The colony still needs protection, he had told them. The Sketh might split their forces, or other predators might see the evacuation as an opportunity. And 3 humans will not significantly change the odds against 100 monsters. But 1 human will? Minji had asked, her voice cracking. 1 human in a choke point with the right weapons might buy enough time. Dae-Young had replied, and that is all I need to do. Buy time until the ships arrive. He had not told them the truth that lived in the deepest part of his heart. He needed to do this alone because he needed to prove something to himself, to the ghost of his sister, to the 14-year-old boy who had hidden while someone who trusted him screamed for help. Some debts could only be paid in blood. The vehicle's sensors beeped, and Dae-Young checked the display. The Sketh swarm had changed direction, turning away from the colony and following the crawler's trail northward. The pheromones were working exactly as expected, drawing the monsters away from the innocent and toward the one who had chosen to fight. It is working, Yanha said softly. They follow us now. That was the plan, Dae-Young replied, keeping his voice calm. By the time they reach the outpost, the colony will be safe, and we only need to survive for 2.5 more days. Yanha was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that surprised him. Why are you really doing this? Sergeant Park, because I have watched humans for many years. And you are different from the others. Harder somehow. Like metal that has been heated and beaten into a new shape. Dae-young did not answer immediately. He focused on driving. On the terrain ahead, on the mission parameters he had memorized. But Yonha waited with the patience of her species. And eventually, the silence became heavier than words. I had a sister once. He finally said. Her name was Soyeon. And she was 12 years old when pirates attacked our family's transport ship. His hands tightened on the controls. I was 14. Old enough to fight, old enough to do something. But I hid in a closet instead while she screamed for me to help her. Yonha made a soft sound of understanding. They took her. Dae-young continued. I never saw her again. Never found out what happened to her. And I've spent 20 years trying to become someone who would not hide. Someone who would fight no matter the odds. And you believe saving me will erase what happened to your sister? No, Dae-young said, and his voice was honest in a way that hurt. Nothing will erase it. Because she screamed my name, and I did nothing. And I will hear that scream until I die. He looked at Yonha, and his eyes were steady despite the pain behind them. But your children have not done anything wrong yet. And they deserve the chance to be born, to grow up, to make their own choices about who they want to be. Yonha reached out with one of her 4 arms and touched his shoulder gently. You are a strange creature, Sergeant Park. And I mean that as the highest compliment my people can give. The mining outpost appeared on the horizon, just as the first moon rose over the mountains. It was an ugly structure. All sharp angles and reinforced walls, built for function rather than beauty. The main entrance was a massive door designed to withstand explosions. And the corridors inside were narrow enough that only 2 or 3 bodies could pass through at once. It was, Dae-young thought with grim satisfaction, the perfect place to fight a war of attrition. They parked the crawler inside the vehicle bay and sealed the outer doors. Dae-young moved quickly through the facility, assessing defensive positions and planning his strategy, while Yonha followed as best she could. You will stay in the deepest chamber, he told her, guiding her toward a reinforced room at the heart of the complex. There is an emergency communication link connected to the colony, and I want you to stay in contact with them so they know we are still alive. And where will you be? Yonha asked, though she already knew the answer. Between you and everything that wants to hurt you. Dae-young replied simply. He spent the next 3 hours fortifying the facility. With brutal efficiency, he sealed secondary entrances, with welding torches and piled mining equipment against doors to create additional barriers. He positioned the weapons he had brought. 2 assault rifles, 4 pistols, a crate of grenades, and a collection of improvised explosives he had assembled from mining supplies. He created killing zones at every choke point, places where enemies would be forced to bunch together and become easy targets. And finally, when there was nothing left to prepare, he sat down in the main corridor and waited. Yonha. His voice came through the communication link he had clipped to his vest. Colony reports the Sketh swarm has passed their position without stopping, she said. Everyone is safe. Good. The Dae-young replied, that means the plan is working. They also report that the swarm is moving faster now, and sensors estimate arrival at our position within 2 hours. Dae-young closed his eyes and breathed deep. 2 hours. Until 117 monsters arrived at his door. 2 hours. Until he found out if 20 years of training and guilt and desperate hope had forged him into something strong enough to protect 2 innocent lives. Sergeant Park. Yonha said softly through the link, I want you to know that regardless of what happens tonight, my children will grow up knowing your name, and they will know that a human chose to fight for them when he could have chosen to run. Dae-young smiled despite everything. Then make sure they grow up to be the kind of people worth fighting for. The communication link clicked off, and De-Yoon was alone with the silence and the waiting. He checked his weapons one final time, making sure every magazine was loaded and every grenade was within easy reach, and then, in the distance, he heard the first Sketh scream. It was a sound like metal being torn apart, like nightmares given voice, like death announcing its arrival. More screams joined the first, a chorus of clicking and shrieking that grew louder with every passing minute. De-Yoon stood and raised his rifle. The motion sensor at the main entrance began to flash red, counting contacts as the swarm gathered outside. 10 contacts became 20, 20 became 50, 50 became 117. Massive doors shuddered as the first Sketh slammed against it. Testing its strength, more impacts followed, a drumbeat of violence that shook dust from the ceiling. De-Yoon aimed at the door and waited. He thought of his sister. He thought of Yonha and her unborn twins, thought of the boy who had hidden in a closet and the man who had sworn never to hide. Again the door began to buckle. The warning sirens screamed across the colony of Korath 7. As the sun began to set behind the purple mountains, Sergeant De-Yoon Park dropped his coffee cup and ran toward the command center, his boots pounding against the metal walkways that connected the farming domes. He had served as a security officer on this remote agricultural world for 2 years now, protecting a joint settlement of humans and Valorians, and he had never heard the sirens sound with such urgency. The Valorians were a graceful species with 4 arms and skin that shimmered like pearl in the light. They stood taller than humans and moved with an elegance that made even their simplest gestures look like dancing. But they were pacifists by nature, gentle beings who believed that violence was a primitive response to problems that could be solved through wisdom and patience. They had welcomed humans into their colony because humans were useful for tasks that required physical courage, even if the Valorians privately considered such courage to be a form of mental limitation. De-Yoon burst into the command center and found Elder Toven standing before a massive display screen, his 4 hands clasped together in the Valorian gesture of deep concern. The Elder's normally calm face had gone pale, and his large violet eyes were fixed on the swarm of red dots moving across the sensor grid. "Sketh," Toven said without turning around, his voice carrying the weight of absolute dread. Yoon felt his stomach drop. The Sketh were nightmares given physical form, insectoid predators that stood as tall as a man and hunted in massive packs. Their bodies were covered in black chitin harder than steel, and their limbs ended in blades that could slice through armor like paper. They communicated through clicks and screams that sounded like metal being torn apart. And they showed no mercy, no hesitation, no fear. A single Sketh could kill an armed soldier if the soldier made even one mistake. A swarm of them was considered a natural disaster, something you fled from rather than fought. "How many?" De-Yoon asked, already knowing he would not like the answer. "Our sensors count 117, Toven replied, and his voice cracked on the last word. "Evacuation ships are 3 days away, and our barriers will hold for perhaps 6 hours once the swarm arrives." De-Yoon looked at the display and calculated the distance. The swarm would reach them by midnight. Turned to the other 2 human guards who had followed him into the command center. A young woman named Sergeant Minji Kang and an older man named Corporal Yunsu Choi. They exchanged glances that communicated everything words could not. They were going to die here, and they knew it, but they would not run. "Begin evacuation to the central bunker," De-Yoon ordered. "Get everyone inside and seal the doors." The chaos that followed was controlled, but desperate Evalorian families gathered their children and hurried toward the bunker at the heart of the colony, their forearms carrying bags and precious belongings. Workers helped direct traffic and calm the panicking crowds. De-Yoon moved through the chaos like a stone in a river, solid and unmovable, while everything flowed around him, and then he saw here Yanha was a Valorian woman struggling to walk toward the medical center. Her body heavy with pregnancy, she moved slowly, painfully, and her face was twisted with fear that went beyond the general panic. Dae-young had spoken with her several times over the past month. Her husband had died in a farming accident, leaving her alone with twins growing inside her, and twins were sacred to the Valorians. A blessing so rare that they occurred perhaps once in a generation. Dae-young changed direction and moved to her side. "Let me help you," he said. Offering his arm, Yanha looked at him with eyes that held a terrible knowledge, and she shook her head slowly. "It will not matter," she whispered. "They are coming for me." Dae-young did not understand at first, but Yanha explained with the calm voice of someone who had already accepted death. Her pregnancy had triggered a rare hormonal condition that caused her body to produce specific pheromones, and these pheromones were exactly what attracted Sketh across vast distances. Swarm was not attacking the colony. The swarm was hunting her. The elders know, Yanha continued, her voice barely audible above the sirens. I heard them talking before the announcement was made, discussing whether one life was worth risking everyone. Calculating the math of sacrifice, she placed her 4 hands on her swollen belly. I have made peace with it, human, and I will walk out into the fields before they arrive so that the swarm takes only me and my children. Something cold and hard settled in Dae-young's chest. Had felt this sensation only once before in his life. 20 years ago, when he had hidden in a closet while pirates raided his family's transport ship. He had been 14 years old, and he had listened to his younger sister scream for him to help her. And he had done nothing because he was afraid the pirates had taken her. And he had never seen her again. He had spent every day since then trying to become someone different, someone who would not hide, someone who would fight even when fighting meant dying. And now a mother was preparing to sacrifice herself and her unborn twins because a swarm of monsters had decided she smelled like prey. No, Dae-young said, and the word came out flat and final. You will not walk anywhere except to safety. Yanha looked at him with confusion. You do not understand the numbers. Human, because 100 Sketh cannot be stopped by barriers or bullets or bravery. I understand the numbers perfectly. Dae-young replied, I just do not accept them. He helped Yanha to the medical center and made sure she was comfortable before walking back to the command center where Elder Tovan was coordinating the evacuation. The Valorian leader looked exhausted, his forearms hanging limp at his sides, and his eyes carried the weight of impossible decisions. Elder, Dae-young said, and his voice cut through the noise like a blade. I have an alternative plan. Tovan turned to face him, and hope flickered briefly in his violet eyes before dying. There is no alternative, Sergeant Park, because the swarm follows the pheromones, and the pheromones come from Yanha, and Yanha cannot be hidden or masked or protected. She cannot be hidden here. Dae-young agreed, but she can be moved, and the swarm will follow her wherever she goes. Tovan's eyes widened as understanding dawned. You want to take her away from the colony. The abandoned mining outpost 40 kilometers north has narrow corridors and heavy doors. Dae-young said, it was built to withstand cave-ins and equipment explosions, and it has one main entrance that can be fortified into a choke point. So I will take Yanha there and hold the position until evacuation ships arrive. You would be fighting 100 Sketh alone, Tovan said, his voice filled with disbelief. That is not a rescue mission, but simply a different location for 2 deaths. Dae-young smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. You are probably right, he admitted. But probably is not certainly. And I have discovered that humans can do remarkable things when probably is all they have left. Tovan stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in the elder's expression. Why would you do this? Sergeant Park, because you barely know this woman. And she is not even of your species. De Jong thought about his sister, about the screams he still heard in his dreams, about 20 years of guilt that had shaped him into something harder than the Sketh's chitin armor. Because I am tired of calculating odds, he finally said, and because someone has to stay when running is the smarter choice. He turned and walked toward the medical center to collect the Yonha behind him. Elder Tovin watched the human leave and felt something he had never expected to feel toward one of these violent, primitive, irrational creatures. He felt respect.